Clara sat at the lone table in the middle of the chess club, her eyes fixed on the board in front of her. The room was filled with the muffled sound of chess pieces clicking as other players quietly studied their games. She'd been coming here for weeks, watching from the sidelines, trying to learn by observing. But today was different. Today, she was ready to play. Her fingers hovered over the pieces, tracing the familiar paths they would take. Just as she prepared to make her first move, a voice sliced through the silence. "So, you really think you can play here?" The words dripped with condescension. Clara looked up to see Gustavo, the club's reigning champion, standing over her, his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Behind him, a small crowd of men had gathered, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief. "I'm here to compete, just like anyone else," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Gustavo chuckled, shaking his head. "This club isn't for girls like you. Chess is serious business. It's about strategy, patience, qualities you wouldn't understand." His words were a knife, each one cutting deeper than the last. The men behind him snickered, their eyes gleaming with mockery. Clara felt her face flush, but she held her ground. "I know how to play," she insisted, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She wouldn't let them see how much their words affected her. Gustavo's smirk widened as he reached down and with one sweeping motion, knocked the pieces off the board. The sound of the chess pieces scattering across the floor echoed in the room. "Why don't you go play with dolls, little girl?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "Leave chess to the men." The room erupted in laughter, a cruel chorus that seemed to come from every corner. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, mocking. For a moment she considered leaving, walking out the door and never coming back. But something stopped her. She wouldn't let them win. Not like this. Without a word, Clara knelt down and began picking up the pieces one by one. The room slowly quieted as she placed each piece back on the board, meticulously, with care. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the crowd that had gathered. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart and the quiet click of the pieces as they found their place once again. When she finally stood, the room had gone silent. She met Gustavo's gaze, her eyes steady, her voice firm. "You can knock the pieces down all you want. It won't stop me." Gustavo looked at her, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. But then, with a shrug, he turned away. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Clara watched him walk away, the crowd slowly dispersing. She was alone again, the board set before her. She stared down at it, her mind racing. The humiliation burned, but it ignited something deeper inside her, a determination that she hadn't felt before. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The quiet walk home from the chess club felt heavier than usual. Clara's mind kept replaying Gustavo's smug grin and the laughter of the men. Every step seemed to echo with the humiliation she had just endured. But with each step, something else grew within her, a fiery resolve. She would prove them wrong. She had to. Once home, Clara slipped into the small room that had once belonged to her grandfather. His old chessboard still sat on a wooden table by the window, the pieces neatly arranged as if he might walk in and sit down for a game at any moment. She could still remember the nights they spent together, his patient voice guiding her through the opening moves, teaching her to think 3, 4 steps ahead. He had always told her she had a natural gift for the game, and he made her promise that one day she would become a great player. "Chess is about more than pieces on a board," he had said. "It's about knowing yourself, knowing your opponent, and believing in the moves you make." Clara had held on to those words ever since. Kneeling by the table, she traced her fingers over the worn edges of the chess pieces. She had played countless games alone here, practicing against herself, refining her skills. But now, if she wanted to face players like Gustavo, she needed more than solitary games. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mr. Ribeiro, a longtime family friend and a former member of the chess club. He had played alongside her grandfather years ago before being pushed out by the same crowd that now taunted Clara. Mr. Ribeiro had always believed in her, just as her grandfather had. "I heard what happened today," he said, stepping inside. "I imagine it wasn't easy." Clara shook her head, the frustration evident in her eyes. "They don't think I can do it. They think chess is only for them, like they own the game." Mr. Ribeiro gave a sad smile. "That's how they've always been. But your grandfather saw something special in you, and I do too." He paused for a moment, then added, "If you're serious about this, I can help you. We can train, but it won't be easy." Clara met his gaze, her resolve strengthening. "I'm ready." And so their training began. Every night after the world had quieted down, Clara would meet Mr. Ribeiro in the dimly lit room. He would challenge her with complex positions and push her to think beyond the obvious moves. She quickly realized that Gustavo and the other club members played predictable, traditional games. They relied on brute force rather than creativity. Mr. Ribeiro encouraged her to think differently, to approach the game in ways that would catch them off guard. "They expect you to play like them," he said one night, watching as she struggled with a difficult endgame. "But if you use what they don't see coming, you'll have the advantage." It wasn't long before Clara felt her confidence returning. The moves came quicker, her strategy sharper. She had never been more certain of her abilities. But Mr. Ribeiro had one more lesson for her. "There's a tournament coming up," he said, his voice measured. "The state championship. I've already arranged for you to enter, but under a different name." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "They won't accept you as Clara, not yet," he explained. "But if you play under a pseudonym, you can show them your skill first. Prove yourself, and then reveal who you really are." The idea of playing as someone else made her uncomfortable, but she understood the necessity. They wouldn't take her seriously as Clara. But maybe, just maybe, as someone else, she could make them see her for the player she was. "All right," Clara agreed. "Let's do it." Mr. Ribeiro smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be brilliant, Clara. Just remember, this is about more than a game. It's about proving to yourself and to them what you're capable of." With her new identity and her skills sharpened, Clara was ready. The tournament would be her stage, and she was determined to show the world that she belonged at the table. The following weeks blurred into a routine of intense training and late-night matches against Mr. Ribeiro. Clara absorbed every tactic, every lesson, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. But it wasn't enough to just study the game in secret. She needed real opponents, people who didn't know her as the girl who didn't belong. That's when Mr. Ribeiro introduced her to the underground chess circuit. It wasn't exactly illegal, but it wasn't the polished world of official clubs either. Players from all walks of life gathered in the back rooms of cafes and dimly lit basements, where names didn't matter as much as your ability to hold your own on the board. Clara felt a thrill the first time she stepped into one of those underground rooms. The air was thick with concentration and tension, but there were no judging eyes, no one mocking her before she had a chance to prove herself. It was pure competition, based solely on skill, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt like she belonged. "Remember," Mr. Ribeiro whispered as they entered. "Here, you're Carlos. Keep your focus. Let your moves do the talking." Carlos. The name felt foreign on her tongue, but it was her shield. No one knew who Clara was in these circles. They only saw the serious expression, the confident hands moving pieces across the board, and the steady gaze of someone who knew the game inside and out. Her first few matches went smoothly. She played cautiously at first, gauging her opponent's strengths and weaknesses, but quickly realized that many of them underestimated her under the guise of a young man. Clara, Carlos, capitalized on that, setting up traps and watching with satisfaction as her opponents fell into them. The thrill of winning began to take over, and with each match, her confidence grew. Word started to spread about Carlos, the mysterious newcomer who had begun making waves in the underground scene. No one knew where this player had come from, but they couldn't deny the skill. Mr. Ribeiro watched from the sidelines, nodding approvingly as Clara climbed the ranks. "You're ready," he said one night after another victory. "But remember, this is only the beginning. The state tournament is a different beast. They won't be so easily fooled. Clara knew he was right. The underground tournaments had given her the confidence she needed, but she was about to step into the lion's den. The state championship would be full of seasoned players like Gustavo, people who thought they knew everything about the game. But Clara wasn't the same girl they had laughed at weeks ago. She had learned to anticipate moves, to see beyond the obvious, and to exploit the arrogance of those who underestimated her. As the tournament approached, Clara prepared for her biggest challenge yet, facing the players from the official chess world while continuing to hide behind the identity of Carlos. She felt a pang of discomfort every time she thought about it. Playing as Carlos was a necessary deception, but it also felt like she was hiding part of herself. Would they respect her as much if they knew she was Clara? Or would the mockery start all over again? Mr. Ribeiro sensed her hesitation. "You've earned this," he reminded her one evening as they wrapped up another training session. "The name doesn't matter. What matters is what you can do on that board. Once they see your skill, nothing else will matter." Clara nodded, trying to push away the doubts. This wasn't about recognition or ego. It was about proving to herself and to them that she deserved a seat at the table. She had worked too hard to back down now. The night before the tournament, she sat alone in her grandfather's study, staring at the chessboard they had once used. The memories of his gentle guidance and unwavering belief in her flooded back. "I won't let you down," she whispered, her fingers brushing the pieces. "I'll show them what I can do." The day of the tournament arrived, and Clara, now fully assuming the identity of Carlos, stepped into the grand hall where the competition would be held. The atmosphere was different from the underground matches. It was colder, more formal, and the eyes that swept over her seemed more calculating, more judging. But they didn't see Clara. They saw Carlos, another competitor, another player they would underestimate. Clara squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. This was her moment, the chance she had been working toward for weeks. She wouldn't let the nerves get to her, wouldn't let the pressure make her falter. In her mind, she had already played these games 1,000 times, and she knew exactly how to win. The grand hall buzzed with the quiet intensity of the competitors gathered for the state chess championship. Rows of tables stretched across the polished floor, each one adorned with an identical chessboard, pieces neatly arranged in their starting positions. The air was thick with concentration, the kind that made Clara feel both excited and anxious at the same time. For the first time in her life, she wasn't on the outside looking in. She was about to compete on the biggest stage she'd ever known. Disguised as Carlos, she stepped into the room, her heart racing with anticipation. Mr. Ribeiro had been right. This was a different world than the underground tournaments. Everything here was formal, serious, and calculated. The men who filled the room exuded a quiet confidence, their expressions betraying little emotion. They barely glanced at Carlos, just another competitor among many. Clara welcomed their indifference. It gave her the advantage of invisibility. She found her name on the tournament roster, well, Carlos's name, and walked toward her assigned table. The early rounds would determine who advanced to the final stages, where the best of the best would face off. Clara scanned the room, spotting Gustavo a few tables away. His presence loomed large in the competition. He was, after all, the reigning champion, and everyone expected him to defend his title with ease. Clara sat down across from her first opponent, a man who looked to be in his late 30s with a sharp gaze and fingers that tapped the edge of the table impatiently. He didn't seem to notice her arrival, busy adjusting his pieces and settling into his seat. As soon as the match began, Clara felt her nerves fade, replaced by the familiar calm of focus. She was in her element now, her mind sharpening with each move. Her opponent played well, but he was predictable, using traditional strategies she had seen many times before. Clara knew how to exploit that. She moved quickly and decisively, setting traps and forcing her opponent to make mistakes. The match didn't last long. When she executed a flawless checkmate, her opponent blinked in surprise, as if he hadn't expected the game to end so quickly. He gave a brief nod of respect before rising from the table and moving on without a word. It was a quiet victory, but one that left Clara with a surge of confidence. One down, many more to go. As the rounds progressed, Clara found herself advancing further into the tournament. The competition grew fiercer with each match, but her strategy was always the same: stay unnoticed, let them underestimate her, and then strike with precision. Under the guise of Carlos, no one treated her with the same mocking disdain they had shown Clara at the chess club. Here, she was just another competitor, another mind on the board. The days blurred together in a whirlwind of moves, strategies, and victories. With every win, Clara felt herself inching closer to the final match, where she knew she would face Gustavo. She had seen him in action, watching his games from a distance. He was skilled, no doubt about that, but he played with the arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged. He relied on intimidation, using his reputation to unnerve his opponents before the game even started. But Clara wasn't afraid of him. She knew his weaknesses, and she knew she could exploit them. As the final day of the tournament approached, Clara found herself standing just one match away from the championship round. Her semi-final opponent was a seasoned player known for his defensive style. He played cautiously, refusing to take risks, which made the game drag on for hours. But Clara didn't lose her patience. She had trained for this, learned to think beyond the obvious moves. Slowly, methodically, she chipped away at his defenses, building pressure until finally, with a well-timed sacrifice, she cornered his king and delivered the decisive blow. Clara sat back, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had done it. She was in the final. As she stood to leave, a voice stopped her. "Carlos, right?" Clara turned to see Gustavo standing a few feet away, arms crossed, a bemused smile on his face. He had been watching her game, and now his eyes swept over her with a calculating look. "I've been hearing things about you," he said, stepping closer. "Impressive run for a newcomer. But don't think for a second that I'm worried. The finals are a different game, and I don't lose." Clara met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything to wipe that smug look off his face. But instead, she simply nodded. She wasn't going to let him see her rattle. Not yet. "We'll see," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. As she left the hall, the weight of what was to come settled on her shoulders. The final match would be her biggest challenge yet. Not just because Gustavo was the reigning champion, but because it would be her chance to finally reveal the truth. After all the deception, after all the months of training and hiding behind the name Carlos, she would show them who she really was. And whether they liked it or not, they would have to accept her. The day of the final match arrived, and the atmosphere in the tournament hall felt different. There was a quiet buzz of anticipation as the crowd gathered, eager to witness the championship game. All eyes were on the two finalists, Gustavo, the reigning champion, and Carlos, the mysterious newcomer who had taken the tournament by storm. Clara, disguised as Carlos, sat at her designated table, the weight of the moment settling on her. This was it, the match she had been preparing for, the one that could finally change everything. Across from her, Gustavo exuded confidence. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, giving her a smug grin that made her stomach turn. "You've had a good run," he said, his voice low and patronizing. "But you're in over your head now. This is where it ends." Clara didn't respond. She simply stared at the board, letting the pieces fall into place in her mind. She had spent weeks studying Gustavo's games, analyzing his tendencies, memorizing his favorite opening moves. He played aggressively, relying on intimidation and brute force to overwhelm his opponents. But Clara had a plan, one that Gustavo wouldn't see coming. The referee signaled the start of the match, and Gustavo made his first move, a classic opening he had used countless times before. Clara recognized it instantly. She responded with a calm, measured move of her own, careful not to reveal too much of her strategy too early. The game unfolded slowly at first, each move deliberate and cautious. Gustavo seemed relaxed, almost bored, as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake. Clara kept her focus, refusing to be distracted by his smug demeanor. She played defensively, letting him push forward. But she wasn't just reacting, she was setting a trap, building her strategy with every move. As the middle game approached, the tension in the room began to rise. The quiet murmur of the spectators faded, replaced by the sharp clicks of the chess pieces and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Gustavo's expression had shifted from amusement to concentration. He realized that this wouldn't be the easy win he had expected. Clara kept her emotions in check, even as she saw her plan coming together. She had studied this opening, prepared for his attacks, and now she was ready to counter. With a calculated series of moves, she began to shift the momentum of the game. She sacrificed a knight, forcing Gustavo to take it, and in doing so, she opened up his defenses. Gustavo frowned, his eyes narrowing as he studied the board. He realized too late that he had fallen into her trap. Clara pressed her advantage, moving her pieces into position with precision and speed. She could feel the tide turning. Gustavo's confidence was slipping, and the crowd had taken notice. The game reached its climax with both players locked in a fierce battle for control. Gustavo, now visibly frustrated, tried to regain the upper hand, launching a desperate attack on Clara's king, but she was ready. She saw the move coming from a mile away and countered with a series of rapid moves that left his king exposed. And then it happened. With a single decisive move, Clara placed her queen on the board, delivering a clean and devastating checkmate. The room fell silent. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Gustavo stared at the board in disbelief, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had lost. The reigning champion, defeated by an unknown player, a newcomer who had outsmarted him at every turn. Clara sat back, her heart pounding in her chest, but her expression remained calm. She had done it. She had beaten Gustavo, just as she had known she could. Gustavo looked up at her, his face a mixture of shock and anger. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Clara stood slowly, the moment she had been waiting for finally arriving. She could feel the weight of the room's attention on her, every eye watching, every breath held in anticipation. "I'm not Carlos," she said, her voice steady and clear. She reached up and pulled off the cap she had been wearing, letting her hair fall free around her shoulders. "My name is Clara." The gasps from the audience were immediate. Whispers rippled through the crowd, shock and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Clara stood tall, meeting Gustavo's stunned gaze with unwavering confidence. You tricked us," he stammered, his arrogance cracking. I didn't trick anyone," Clara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I played the game, and I won." The crowd erupted into murmurs, a mix of admiration and disbelief. Gustavo, still reeling from the shock, looked down at the board as if hoping to find some mistake, some error that would explain his defeat. But there was none. Clara had beaten him fair and square. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a single clap echoed through the room, followed by another and another. The applause grew louder, swelling into a full ovation as the crowd acknowledged Clara's victory. Mr. Ribeiro, standing at the back of the room, smiled proudly. Clara had done more than win a game. She had shattered the barriers that had been placed in front of her, proving that skill, not gender, was what truly mattered. As Clara stood there, listening to the applause, she felt a surge of pride and relief. She had won, not just the match, but the respect she had fought so hard to earn. And though the road ahead would still have its challenges, she knew now that she belonged. The applause filled the room, a sound Clara had never imagined would be directed at her. At Clara, not Carlos. It was as if the room had finally woken up to the reality she had always known. For a brief moment, she stood there, soaking in the recognition she had fought so hard for. But the applause was cut short as Gustavo slammed his hands on the table, his face flushed with anger. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice rising above the crowd. "You can't just walk in here, pretend to be someone else and expect this to count." Clara felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she didn't flinch. "I didn't pretend to be anyone. I came here to play chess, and I won." Her voice was calm, steady, even as Gustavo's fury grew. "She broke the rules," Gustavo continued, looking around at the tournament officials. "She deceived everyone." For a moment, there was an uncomfortable murmur among the officials. Clara could see their uncertainty. She wasn't Carlos, the player they had accepted into the tournament. She was Clara, the girl who had been laughed out of the chess club, the girl they had all dismissed. But before the officials could respond, Mr. Ribeiro stepped forward from the back of the room. His voice was calm, but it carried authority. The only thing Clara did was play the game, and she played it better than anyone here. There was a pause as his words settled over the room. Clara could feel the tension shifting. People began to see what had really happened. She hadn't cheated or deceived anyone. She had simply used the only path available to her, the only way she could get a seat at the table. One of the officials, an older man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "The tournament is about skill," he said, his voice deliberate. "It's about who plays the best game. And today, Clara played the best game." Gustavo looked ready to argue, but the official silenced him with a glance. "The victory stands." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The victory wasn't just hers, it was official. Gustavo stood there, stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But there was nothing left to say. The match was over, and Clara had won, fair and square. The crowd, which had been watching the exchange in tense silence, slowly began to clap again. It wasn't as explosive as before, but it was steady and genuine. Clara looked around, seeing faces that once might have dismissed her, now offering something she had longed for: respect. Mr. Ribeiro approached her, his smile wide and proud. "I told you they couldn't deny you forever," he said softly. "You've earned this." Clara nodded, her chest swelling with pride. But she knew it wasn't just about this one moment. It was about everything that had led up to it. The countless hours of practice, the humiliation, the frustration, and finally, the victory. She had fought for this, not just for herself, but for every girl who had ever been told she didn't belong. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara caught a glimpse of Gustavo, standing at the edge of the room, his face still red with embarrassment. For a moment, their eyes met, and Clara felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. He had been so certain that his position was untouchable, that his gender gave him an automatic right to the top. Now he knew better. Without a word, Gustavo turned and walked out of the hall, leaving Clara standing alone at the center of the room. The official approached her again, holding out the championship trophy, a gleaming symbol of everything she had accomplished. "You've earned this," he said, placing the trophy in her hands. Clara held the trophy for a moment, feeling the cool metal against her skin. It was heavier than she expected, but it felt right. She had earned this, not by pretending to be someone else, but by proving that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. As the hall emptied out, Mr. Ribeiro lingered beside her. "So what's next for you?" he asked, his voice light with curiosity. Clara smiled. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I do know one thing. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Mr. Ribeiro nodded, his eyes twinkling with pride. "I think your grandfather would be very proud of you today." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat at the mention of her grandfather. She glanced down at the trophy in her hands and thought of the promise she had made all those years ago. "I hope so," she said softly. As she walked out of the tournament hall, the trophy tucked securely under her arm, Clara felt lighter than she had in months. She had proven herself in the world of chess, but more importantly, she had proven something to herself, that she was capable of more than anyone had ever given her credit for. And now, she knew, there were no limits to what she could do. The weeks following Clara's victory at the state championship felt like a whirlwind. News of her triumph spread quickly, and soon Clara's name was on everyone's lips. Not Carlos, but Clara. She had become a symbol of defiance, of challenging outdated traditions, and of proving that talent had nothing to do with gender. The chess club that had once barred her from playing now found itself in the spotlight. The public pressure was undeniable. People began questioning the club's exclusionary practices, and soon, even the most stubborn members realized that change was inevitable. They could no longer hide behind their rules or their pride. Clara stood outside the club one bright afternoon, staring up at the familiar door. It was the same door that had been slammed in her face just months ago, the same door she had walked away from in anger and frustration. But today, things were different. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and quiet concentration greeted her. A few members glanced up as she entered, recognizing her instantly. There were no more smirks, no mocking smiles, only respect. She had been invited back, not as an observer, but as a member. And though it felt like a small victory, Clara knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. Gustavo, noticeably absent since the tournament, had resigned as president of the club shortly after his defeat. His departure left a void, and Clara had been asked to help reshape the club's future. She hadn't decided yet how she wanted to be involved, but one thing was clear: the chess club would never again be a place that excluded anyone based on outdated ideas of who could play. As she moved toward the back of the room, Clara saw a group of young girls seated around a table, their heads bent in concentration as they studied the chessboard in front of them. They didn't look up when Clara approached, too focused on the game to notice her arrival. A smile spread across her face as she watched them, remembering how she had once sat at the same tables, longing for the chance to play. Mr. Ribeiro, standing nearby, caught her eye and nodded approvingly. "They're here because of you," he said softly. "You've shown them that they belong." Clara felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. Her victory wasn't just about proving herself. It was about paving the way for others. The young girls sitting at that table didn't have to hide who they were or pretend to be someone else. They could play openly, confidently, knowing that they had a right to be there. "It feels good to see them like this," Clara said, her voice thoughtful. "But there's still so much more to do." Mr. Ribeiro smiled. "And you're the one to do it. You've already started." In the weeks after the tournament, Clara had decided to open a chess school, specifically aimed at young girls and women who wanted to learn the game but had never been given the chance. She had rented a small space in the city, using the prize money from the tournament to buy equipment and hire coaches. It wasn't a grand opening, but it was a start. Clara wanted her school to be more than just a place to learn chess. She wanted it to be a community, a place where girls could come together, support each other, and develop their confidence, not just as chess players, but as individuals. The game, after all, had taught her more than strategy and tactics. It had taught her resilience, patience, and the importance of believing in herself, even when no one else did. The club had also begun to change. New rules were implemented, opening the doors to women and young players, ensuring that no one would ever face the kind of exclusion Clara had endured. There were still some who grumbled, some who clung to the old ways, but Clara knew that progress didn't happen all at once. It happened step by step, game by game, victory by victory. As she stood in the club that day watching the young players, Clara realized that her journey had come full circle. She had started as an outsider, mocked and underestimated, but now she was a champion, not just in the game of chess, but in the fight for inclusion and equality. Mr. Ribeiro joined her at the edge of the room, the two of them standing in comfortable silence as they watched the next generation of players take their first steps. "You've done something remarkable," he said, his voice filled with pride. Clara smiled softly, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Mr. Ribeiro shook his head. "You always had the strength, Clara. You just needed to find your way. And now, there's no limit to what you can do." Clara nodded, her mind already racing with ideas for the future. There was so much more to accomplish. More tournaments, more schools, more opportunities to challenge the status quo. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but she had proven to herself that she could handle whatever came her way. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow over the chess tables, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. She had kept her promise to her grandfather, honoring his legacy through her love of the game. But more importantly, she had carved out a place for herself and for others like her in a world that had once shut its doors to them. And now, as she looked out over the chessboards, filled with new players and fresh opportunities, Clara knew that this was only the beginning.